On this week's 51%, we sit down with Hollywood speech coach Samara Bay to learn how to recognize the power in our voices and get what we want out of them.
So the new sound of power is varied. It has to be. To me, this idea of the new sound of power is that it reflects our actual lived experience in our voice.
We also speak with History at Play's Judith Kalaora about her one-woman show on the story of America's heroine, Deborah Sampson. I'm Jesse King. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing shy Lolita. I wasn't really in it, I didn't really get it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jesse King. I've got a simple question to start today's episode. When was the last time you had to listen back to your own voice, and what did you make of it? For me, well, I work in radio, so I'm listening back to my own recordings all the time. And there's this assumption, I think, that if you work in radio, you must love the sound of your own voice. I'm sure there's a lot of people who do, but for me at least, that is not the case. I still wince from time to time, like I sound so much younger than I actually am, my voice is so much thinner than I think. Who is this person? Hopefully it's not too noticeable, but I spend a lot of time practicing my radio voice to sound more natural, more clear, more confident. Does it reflect my normal day-to-day voice? I'm not so sure. Our main guest today has a lot of experience in the way we change our voices. Samara Bay is a Hollywood dialect and speech coach who has worked with actors like Rachel McAdams and Penelope Cruz, as well as congressional candidates and CEOs preparing for everything from keynote addresses to pitch meetings. She's helped clients tackle new dialects, yes, but she's particularly intrigued by the way women alter their voices on a daily basis. The way we lower or raise our pitch, contain our emotion, or modify our message with repeated likes and you-knows. Bay herself lost her voice for a period in college, and it was only after extensive doctor visits that she realized she had somewhere along the way changed her natural voice to a pitch lower than what her body preferred. Why do we do this? In her new book, Permission to Speak, How to Change What Power Sounds Like, Starting with You, Bay explores the inherent power dynamics in the way we communicate. She says the U.S. has voice standards the same way it has beauty standards. And traditionally, those standards have sounded like wealthy white men.
If any of us Google how to sound more authoritative, or how do I sound like a leader, we'll all see the exact same answers. They're very, I would like to say, suspiciously consistent. Keep your voice low, right? We don't want anything high-pitched that sounds like you're enthusiastic. That's way too naive. Speak at, this is all over the internet, 70 to 75% your normal speaking rate, right? So now we're talking pace, like a measured pace. Don't do too much swooping up and down pitch-wise. You'll sound, quote unquote crazy. Certainly don't have spontaneous emotional reactions. You'll seem unhinged again. And then, yes, the fluidity of speech, right? Hedging terms, which like sometimes fits into the category of and just. There's a lot of, quote unquote think pieces around women saying things like, if you know what I mean. Hedging is basically a linguistic term to capture anything that doesn't feel direct. So we can either say, do this for me, or we could say, hey, if you wouldn't mind, would it be okay if you could just grab that for me? I would super appreciate it. Thanks. But you and I both know, and all of us listening, especially for women, we know that that second version might get us what we want. So we're in this weird conundrum here where we're being told that leadership sounds like stereotypical men, but we often have picked up habits that are stereotypical of women, because proximal power, what happens when you aren't the most powerful person in the room, part of what works is when you make the most powerful people feel good by being indirect. So we've all picked up these amazing habits that have been super useful. And then sometimes when we are eyeing power in a new way, right, when we want to be that most powerful person in the room, we have to get to look at our habits we've picked up and say, which ones have been serving me in a certain role to play small that are no longer serving me, and how would I make that shift? And that is such a nuanced, interesting, like individual conversation. And I think the reason I wrote this book is that that's lost in these larger black and whiteification of either police women's voices or don't police women's voices. And I'm like, the reality of our lived experience lives in the gray area in between. In what rooms do we want to sound more like some version of ourselves that feels free? And in what rooms is that a gamble we're not willing to take?
In the book, you say that everyone has a voice story. What is a voice story? How do you figure out what yours is? And with all these standards that have been pressed on us, how do you identify like what your voice is in that?
To me, it's sort of like a money story. Like, you know how we all have crappy messaging around money, or fill in the blank, something that feels like, a hot topic for you, body story. It's not just a story with a beginning, middle, and end, right? It's a story meaning myths, a collection of messages we've picked up, that we've internalized, that feel so close to us that we wouldn't even know what a different thought process would feel like. Often we have these around our voice, and often they were planted super early by like random comments. I mean, if you start to think about what somebody said to you in second grade, in fifth grade, what your parents said to you, if you were told that you were too loud or too quiet, I've just accidentally ended up being a collector of these stories. So a girl just told me this past week, I remember in high school when I got laryngitis, it would always be the most exciting time because suddenly everybody would be complimenting me in my voice. Right? It's like so messed up. Like, okay, so when you lose your voice and it sounds like gravelly and like way lower, suddenly people notice your voice and they lean in and they go, oh God, that voice is so, whatever. I mean, the word sexy comes to mind. Maybe that's inappropriate in high school, but yeah. And then the takeaway from that, right, is that my regular voice, my healthy voice, turns people off. But don't worry, when I get sick and lose my voice, it's great. And so obviously, in addition to some of the aspects of each of our voice stories having to do with like what our parents sounded like when we grew up, did we know that we had an accent that was different from our classmates or not? And, did we go to college and kind of have an identity renaissance and leave some aspects of ourselves behind? And how do we feel about that? There's also this sort of stuff, these random comments that rattle around in our brain. And then I would pause it. There's this additional layer of kind of shame or awkwardness around why did we let that comment get to us? And some of the stuff I'm really interested in as we kind of clean out the mind gunk around our voices and give ourselves the opportunity to find whatever our voices that feels the most us, the most free, the most, joyful, the most authentic, is what would a voice that feels good feel like? Everybody says find your voice. What would it feel like for your voice to feel found? So, you ask, how do you find, right? There's a billion technical ways. I have a bunch of tools in this book because I'm a coach. So like, I love, practicals, but it's also these big questions of what stories have I been telling myself and am I feeling ready to let them go?
Once we've explored what makes your voice unique and the factors that have contributed to it, how do you use it to get what you want? How do you make that call?
Yeah. I mean, the idea of using your voice to get what you want hinges on you actually being honest with yourself about what you want. If we're in a shame-free zone, which I'm really, really adamant about, and looking at everything through a social justice lens, right? Really being kind to ourselves as we think through what powers have been at play here. What do you want on any particular day? If you have a job interview, is this the job interview where you want to finally make sure that you stay in integrity with yourself the entire time, that you recognize your own voice, that you're not negotiating away parts of your identity that you're going to regret later? And at the end of the day, job or no job, that's the goal. Or is the goal, get this job because you've rent to pay and you can work on the 100% integrity version of yourself once you have a little more power. But today you need that power at whatever cost. I would like to offer that both of those are totally fine. And self-recrimination on either side of those is really easy to fall into, and notice that and be more compassionate with yourself. But how you show up vocally in those two scenarios will be different.
I think personalizing the conversation like this book does, rather than just being like, women need to change, women need to be more direct, is really important. Because I think you're right. Like, what works best for you and gets you what you want could be different in each situation. I mean, you literally have situations where a female boss will shift to that more direct way of speaking that we tell bosses that they need to have. And then they get labeled too bossy, or a whole list of other names that I don't want to say on the radio and things like that.
There's so much, right? I mean, I have a whole chapter on tone because part of what is rarely discussed is not just the what is coming out of our mouth, but the how, right? We can say something really directly, but if we do it with great love, I need you to do this right now, it will come across as different. And part of what I'm interested in, and really this is kind of like the juicy suggestion for all of us listening here, is what kind of leadership would we prefer there to be more of in the world? And how do we be that every time we have the opportunity to speak, whether we're literally leading, a discussion or on a podcast or asking a question, even if that's like the technically low status role in that, power dynamic of a room. When you ask a question, is there's something kind of mischievous and delightful about thinking to yourself, the spotlight is on me. I get to be the kind of leadership I'd like to see more of in the world right now. Does that mean that I find a sense of delight in my question? Does that mean that I do have a little bit more pitch variation up and down? Because when we go up and down in our pitch, not clownishly, but realistically, the way we would with our friends, it codes for vulnerability. We're saying, I'm willing to be seen. And part of what I'm interested in zooming out is most of the advice we've all been given about public speaking runs counter to our actual lived experience of what makes us get excited when we're listening to someone speak. All of our favorite speeches, and I don't even mean like political speeches necessarily, anytime anybody grabs a microphone, any reel that they make on Instagram, anything that makes you go, ooh, I want to share this, right? Your body has the reaction of, I need to share this, it's so good. That person is likely not following any of those rules that Google tells you. They are instead being emotionally available and what I call caring out loud in a way that's like undeniably human and just isn't how this stuff is taught and isn't, these old standards that I think we've outgrown.
Well, in more technical terms, how can we better take care of our voices, keep them healthy?
It's funny because obviously you think like drink a lot of water, sleep a lot, right? This is definitely true. You can look up, what does a voiceover artist tell you about how to take care of your voice? Drink a lot of tea, right? These are all lovely. But to me, they are the little tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg under the water is how much permission do you give yourself? I mean, this is why, the book is called Permission to Speak. The sense of permission captures these really larger questions of how much we trust that we belong in that space. How do we breathe in such a way that we actually allow our thoughts to come out of our mouth unhindered? I mean, breath is it's my first chapter of the book. Of course it is, right? That makes sense. But it's also like, it's not just here's how to lie on the floor and make sure that your diaphragm is actually moving, which by the way, is useful. But it's why might it not be moving? Well, our diaphragm separates our upper and lower part of our torso. Our lower part of our torso is where all of our messy instincts live. It's where often trauma lives. It's where our real emotional responses might live. So of course, if we're going to dip into that, we're going to have less control. And in certain rooms where we don't feel safe, we don't want to go there. But when we have the opportunity to talk about what matters, like it matters, we've really got to take real breaths and get down into that messy spot and discover, surprise ourselves. And that's also how we will make an impact.
For those who dread public speaking, because I know a lot of people do, they get nervous doing it, what advice do you have for calming down and getting over that stage fright?
I have so much advice on that, the generalness of this question, right? See if you're listening, if any of this resonates, but I'll throw some options at you. One, if you do a run or a yoga or anything like that, and you get your body really breathing, it does actually do something to this whole single system that is our bodies that we forget is a single system. Sometimes we accidentally cut ourselves off at the throat and we kind of feel like we're walking around as heads with, blubbery things holding them up. So that's helpful. But in terms of mindset, two things. One, really, really, really commit to thinking about who you are speaking for, whether it's the audience that you're actually in the room talking to and making it about them, or it's about someone who's not there and a voiceless group, right? Especially, this is a stereotype, but if it fits, it fits. Especially for women, we feel a real physical sense of freedom, of relaxation, when we realize that we're not just talking about ourselves or for ourselves, but for someone else. Rebecca Traister said, women's anger diagnoses social injustice. right? It doesn't even have to be anger, but the idea that when we have big emotions, we go, oh God, me, oh, I'm so annoying, or I'm so high maintenance, or I'm so, right, stories about emotions, fill in the blank, right? But instead, if we can be like, ooh, I'm feeling big feelings, who else am I feeling these feelings on behalf of? Instantly, we have more freedom. So that's one. And then the other one is, this is just like, please, everybody do this, but I do this before I do any interview or anything. Give yourself just a moment to think about a time when you were like really seen by someone that you admire, or, you know, an email you got, something where you just had this moment. Maybe it was a hug from a friend where you were just like, oh my God, I'm like really the version of me that I want to be in this person's eyes. And breathe that memory in before you go off and do something. It's called priming for power, right? And you can imagine, of course, we have so many billions of ways we can prime for the opposite. And it does affect the version of us that will show up in that room.
Well, Samara, thanks so much for speaking with me. Lastly, I thought I'd ask, what do you think power sounds like nowadays? How is power changing?
You know, I think it's really helpful for each of us to start listing, like maybe even on a piece of real paper near our desk, people who we love to listen to. Like, obviously what they say and how they say it is inextricably linked. But when we hear, you know, AOC do an Instagram live, and she seems like such a human being and yet also a political figure, that's doing something to us. It's offering us permission to be ourselves, not to be her, right? But to be ourselves in a fresh way. Esther Perel, Michelle and Barack Obama, right? The people who you just like actually love list, they make you feel more human. Keep that list handy, because what often happens is we feel it in that moment that we're listening to them. And then when we have an opportunity to speak, we accidentally revert to wanting to sound like some standard, some old standard of power, like Jerry in corporate over there. That does us such a disservice. So the new sound of power is varied. It has to be. To me, this idea of the new sound of power is that it reflects our actual lived experience in our voice.
Samara Bay is a Hollywood dialect and speech coach and the author of Permission to Speak, How to Change What Power Sounds Like, Starting With You, which comes out February 7th. You'll be able to find it at all major booksellers. To learn more, check out her website. That's samarabay.com. Samara, thanks again.
My pleasure.
Speaking of public speaking, on February 9th, the Storoton Village Museum in West Springfield, Massachusetts will host a one-woman presentation on the life of Deborah Sampson, the first woman to successfully enlist and fight in the American military. It's called Deborah Sampson, A Revolution of Her Own, presented by living history company History at Play. Founder, artistic director, and actress Judith Kalaora says she has heard Sampson more commonly referred to as America's Mulan.
I am the American heroine. A hush fell over the regiment. We were not alone.
Sampson was born near Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1760. Her family struggled financially in her early years, and after her father abandoned the household, she and her siblings were sent to live with different relatives. Eventually, Sampson was bound out as an indentured servant at the age of 10 and spent the rest of her youth working on a local farm, then scraping by as a teacher and weaver. Toward the end of the Revolutionary War, the Continental Army was having trouble getting previous recruits to rejoin the war effort, and Sampson, seeing an opportunity to make a living, put on a man's uniform, lowered her voice, and attempted to enlist under a male pseudonym. Kalaora says the first try didn't take. Sampson was discovered, shamed, and even excommunicated by her local Baptist church as a result. But not long after, she tried again, this time with the 4th Massachusetts Regiment, under the name Robert Shurtleff.
She's deployed at first to West Point, where she does some basic training. And then she is deployed to the Hudson River Valley, where the Continentals are struggling with the Loyals. The Loyals are American-born, but loyal to the King of England, also known as Loyalists. The soldiers called them cowboys because they would ambush Continental troops, they would steal their cattle, and basically make life unlivable for the Continental soldiers. She is serving under several different officers, in fact, which is what makes the story so interesting. You can see the name Robert Shurtleff under multiple muster rolls for different units. And what that means, we believe, is that she was constantly volunteering for what would be considered scouting missions, which were generally very dangerous, because it means you went ahead of the army and you scouted for potential risks. That's the time when these soldiers were generally ambushed by these loyalists because they were traveling in smaller numbers. But these soldiers who would go on for these scouting missions, they are the most elite. And she was selected. She did volunteer, but she was also selected. And these soldiers in time will come to be known as the Army Rangers. So what has always mesmerized me is one of the very first Army Rangers was a woman. And she served under various officers. Her general, for whom she was an aide-de-camp, which is essentially a waiter, was General John Patterson. So that was her commanding officer at the end of her military career.
So how did she keep up her appearance as a man? Like, what were the things that she had to navigate on that front?
One, she was physically strong. So her size, her shoulders were broad from years of manual labor. She was tall. Estimates put her at between 5'6" and 5'7", which is really unusual for a woman at that time period. So she had good genes, to say the least. And she bound her breast. What really intrigues me is knowing that you don't have a rubber band, obviously, in the 18th century, is that she had to rebind her breasts most likely every 48 hours. How does she get this accomplished? Well, likelihood is she has to go out and do it in the evening, in the nighttime when the other soldiers are sleeping. She is very concerned about the evening hours because they sleep in close quarters. One soldier rolls over and his hand flops where maybe it shouldn't flop, and he says, well, something's missing here, or something's here that shouldn't be here. That was really horrifying to her. She was more scared of the peaceful hours than she was scared of the potential combat hours. She's appointed to this position as an aide-de-camp for the general, and it's in good reason. She's a phenomenal soldier, but the added benefit for her is she no longer has to sleep in the A-frame tents with the other soldiers.
Obviously, because we know about her, her story got out at some point. When was she discovered, and what were the consequences for that at that time?
Yeah, she was. She was sent to Philadelphia for a mission. The soldiers had been released from the army without payment. Of course, we had no central government because we hadn't won the war, so we had no treasury. So how can we pay soldiers? So the soldiers started rioting, and the Massachusetts 4th Regiment was sent to stop the rebellion. And on the way, there's a fever that tears through the camp, and she falls ill, and she faints. And she's taken to hospital, and a gentleman by the name of Dr. Barnabas Binney starts to examine her while she's still unconscious and feels the bindings on her chest. He realizes, now he sees that her coat designates that she's a corporal. She's already at this time been promoted to officer. So he says either this person has stolen this coat, or this is a woman who was legitimately promoted to an officer rank and is now laying before me. He brings her to his home, treats her in secret, nurses her back to health, and then releases her on one request, that she deliver a letter that he's written to her commanding officer. And this letter, although we don't have it, is delivered at West Point, and General John Patterson reads it, and it is brought up to Henry Knox, who most likely confers in some way, shape, or form in writing to General Washington. And they do decide to honorably discharge her from the Continental Army.
So because she was honorably discharged, does that mean she was still able to receive the payment that other soldiers got?
So it took 10 years for her to receive payment just for the back payment for the service in the Army. So the Commonwealth of Massachusetts issues her 35 pounds sterling, because we hadn't completely shifted over to dollars yet. So she gets, sort of measly. It would have been kind of 80% or so of what a male soldier would have gotten at that time period. And then she petitions to the U.S. government for pension because she knows other soldiers who served less time than her, and they were receiving pension. She ends up getting not only the support of General Patterson and one of her other officers, Captain Webb, but Paul Revere writes a letter to the gentleman who would later become the Secretary of War, William Eustis. And he says, you got to give this woman a pension because Congress has been so generous to so many people who have deserved it much less. And she does in 1802, 1803, she starts to receive pension payments. She receives them until her death, and then her husband petitions to receive them, and he's the first widower to receive a pension, a military pension.
So she did eventually get married. What was her life like after the war? Did she go back to, I guess, a somewhat typical life at that time?
So she returns home to Massachusetts. She ends up going to live with an aunt. Her aunt thinks that she's her brother, Ephraim. She kind of tries to play the masquerade, and then the aunt figures it out, and she's like, listen, you can't stay here living as a man. You're bringing shame upon our household. And shortly thereafter, she's actually introduced through her family to a gentleman named Benjamin Gadot, who didn't fight in the war. His father was a farmer. They end up having 3 biological children, and then she ends up adopting a 4th child who had been orphaned at the age of 5 days old. So she's a family woman. She's really a matron, and she doesn't speak a whole lot about what she's done in the war. And she tries to kind of avoid it until it becomes evident that her husband is not really made of the same stuff that his father was made of. Benjamin Gadot has problems with carding and dicing, so gambling. He does not have the work ethic that his father had. And so suddenly they go from having a 42-acre or so farm, and then they have to start selling off parcels and leasing it to tenants, and they're still not making ends meet. So Deborah once more shirks her role as a mother, as a wife, as a woman, and she contacts a writer who has had an interest in her story, and Herman Mann is the writer, and they were working on a book together. And she said, well, what if we schedule a speaking tour to help publicize the release of this book? And so she goes on this national lecture tour from 1802 to approximately 1804, where she hits up a large part of Massachusetts and New York, including upstate and also New York City. And she is the first woman to be paid to speak in the United States of America.
Wow. I'd like to talk a little bit about the play itself before we go here. What can audiences expect from your performance? Now that we know that she was an orator, do you include any of her speech in the production?
I do actually incorporate her speech. My favorite part of her speech, it's wrought upon by an enthusiasm and a frenzy that could brook no control. I burst the tyrant bands that held my sex in awe and grasped an opportunity that custom and the world seemed to deny as a natural privilege. And it's just so beautiful. It's, while I'm saying it, I'm really sort of ripping off the 18th century female attire. I call it the 18th century striptease. But it is a really interesting look at how you peel away the layers of womanhood, and right in front of the audience, you can see a person transform. It's a family-friendly performance. A Revolution of Her Own has been performed over 2,000 times, including off-Broadway. It is the flagship production of History at Play, which is a company I founded in 2010, and it's one of 13 immersive living history performances in our repertoire. So I hope folks will join us, and I hope folks will follow History at Play on our socials. It's at History at Play.
Judith Kalaora is the founder and artistic director of History at Play, which offers solo living history productions chronicling the lives of important women in history. She portrays Deborah Sampson in A Revolution of Her Own. The presentation is coming to the Storoton Village Museum in West Springfield, Massachusetts on February 9th at 6 p.m. Judith, thanks for taking the time.
Appreciate it, Jesse. It's been an honor.
You've been listening to 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jesse King. Our associate producer is Jody Cowan. Our executive producer is Dr. Alan Chartock. And our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. A big thanks to Samara Bay and Judith Kalaora for taking the time to speak with us this week. To learn more about our guests and the show, you can check us out at our flagship station's website. That's WAMCpodcast.org. We hope you'll join us next week. Until then, I'm Jesse King, 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. The night that down the hallway. I had to learn how to look away. I lost my cool.